Here's an introduction to deaf culture. So culture, we talked about previously, is a way of doing things. Culture is a group of people with shared attitudes, beliefs, and practices. There are, of course, many different cultures throughout the world. Japanese culture, British culture, even Southern culture within the United States. Social customs that are accepted in one culture may be considered rude or inappropriate in another. Anamindus said, to ignore the reality of varying cultural perspectives is to discount the infinite variety of our humanness. So culture is something that takes into consideration the variety of our humanness. Culture can influence opinions and decisions on marriage, employment, the idea of following your dream, identity, loyalty, obligation, independence, perspective on time, and even views on indoor plumbing. We talked about that when we first talked about culture. Some cultures are collectivist, focusing on what is best for everyone, while others are individualist, focusing on what is best for self. The deaf in the United States have their own culture, which is different from the hearing culture of the United States. Deaf culture is a collectivist culture, as more than 70% of world cultures are. The goals of the group outweigh the goals of the one, and members feel obligations to each other. Collectivist cultures often focus on working together, pooling resources, and sharing information. Deaf people have formed a very tight community, so getting to know each other and keeping each other informed is important. When you meet a deaf person, there are a few common questions he or she will probably ask you. Be prepared to answer these questions and to ask these same kinds of questions, such as, what is your first and last name? Are you deaf or hearing? Where are you from? Are there any deaf people in your family? Who is your ASL teacher? Where are you learning ASL? Why do you want to know ASL? And where did or do you go to school? These are not questions that you would commonly ask another hearing person or get asked by another hearing person when meeting someone for the first time. But deaf people, it's kind of a small deaf world. And people know each other. People used to have a friend who went to the same school, and there's always a connection to be found when you're talking with a deaf person. And so they ask a lot of questions because they're looking for that connection. Who is your ASL teacher? Maybe I know who she is. Where are you learning ASL? Maybe I know somebody else who works there, and then, of course, why do you want to know ASL? If you remember, 75% of deaf children have parents who don't learn to sign. So when they find someone else who is learning to sign, they want to know why, like what drives you? Because for the most part, deaf people do not have experience with people they know learning to sign. So these are common questions that you would probably get asked, and that you would probably be expected to ask back. Where are you from? What's your first and last name? Where did you go to school? Some cultures have an indirect method of communication, while others have a direct method of communication. And cultures lie all along the spectrum. So there's like direct over here and indirect over here. And then there's, everywhere in between as far as direct or indirect methods of communication. Deaf culture values directness in communication. Hearing people may view this as blunt or even rude, but deaf people consider it a mark of connection, of closeness and loyalty and friendship. Anamindus said straight talk, which is, she's talking about being, blunt and straightforward and direct in communication. Straight talk is an expression of intimacy and solidarity among the deaf. As Thomas Holcomb puts it, he was a deaf author, it's the way you would talk to your siblings. And that personally is one of my favorite things about being a part of the deaf culture. I am not, I don't necessarily like bluntness. I'm pretty sensitive. But I love that when I'm with my deaf friends, I just feel like I'm with family. It's a very comfortable place to be. This is a great story, great example about deaf culture. I had a deaf professor once who taught my class over Zoom. At one point during the class, she burped. She signed, "Excuse me," which to this point, that's fine, right? That's kind of what, as in hearing culture, we would expect. That's fine. And then she followed it up with, "I burped coffee." In hearing culture, that is TMI. That is too much information. But in deaf culture, it's completely normal. And none of my deaf peers batted an eye. She signed, "Excuse me." So think about this first, okay? So she burps. She's on mute, right? And half of the students in the class are deaf anyway. So no one heard her. She could have just moved on, but she signed, "Excuse me," and then explained exactly what was happening. So that's a great example of deaf culture, where it's just, here's what it is, right? It's just pretty straightforward, kind of like you'd talk to a sibling. All right. Another point of deaf culture is that deaf people are very comfortable describing physical appearances in ways that hearing people usually are not. Deaf people may say, "You don't look very good today," or "Have you gained weight?" Deaf people neither intend to offend nor take offense at these kinds of statements. Again, it is a sign of closeness and solidarity, like a good friend telling you that you have something in between your teeth. If you don't look very good today, people are just concerned. It's not an insult. It's just, "Hey, what's up?" Or "Have you gained weight? You just look totally different than the last time I saw you." And it's, like I said, it's not intended to be offensive. It's just straightforward. It just is what it is. When hearing people say, "How are you today?" the expected answer is fine. It's more of a greeting than a question. When deaf people ask, "How are you today?" it is a question. They expect truthful, detailed answers and will give you the same. When you're asked, "How are you?" just say, right? Deaf people are very open, much more so than hearing people. Deaf people love getting together because they have a common language and often common experiences that are not to be had in the everyday hearing world. As such, deaf get-togethers are not short and sweet. In fact, they will often go on much later than planned. Just a note on those common experiences. I mean, yes, deaf people like to get together because they have a common language. Yes, obviously. That was my experience when I lived overseas, and I really liked hanging out with other English speakers because I speak English. And so, so that of course would be a common thing for deaf people together, just because they have deaf people to get together just because they have a common language, but they also have common experiences. I love hearing my deaf friends talk about their experiences just in life. And like, they have the weirdest things happen to them. I would wager that every deaf person has gone into a restaurant and been given a menu in Braille. I'm going to let you think about that for just a minute. Given a menu in Braille. So they just have these weird things happen to them like that. And they have this common experience that really nobody else has, nobody else gets. And deaf get-togethers they just love each other. It's a family. They just love each other. And it's, if you say a deaf event ends at, 9, people will be walking out at 11:30. That's just how it is. I, not very long ago, got together with a bunch of my deaf friends and we went out to dinner, and it was cute. We were all kind of like, we were done eating and we were kind of like closing down the table, and getting ready to leave, because we wanted to vacate, it was a busy restaurant. We wanted to vacate the table for other people, And so my deaf friends were, cleaning up and getting ready to go and everything. And I was thinking like, this is kind of ending early. This is kind of interesting. Weird. We get out to the parking lot and my one deaf friend is like, okay, do you guys want to come over? Right. So we just spent like an hour and a half at dinner or whatever, but the socializing and the actually chatting and being together lasts longer than dinner. So, all right, here are some tips for hearing people about deaf culture. If you know ASL, you must always sign in the presence of a deaf person, just period. Okay. Speaking to another hearing person in front of a deaf person without signing is very rude. Always show respect for the value of communication in deaf culture by making sure the deaf person has access to what you are saying. Always sign in front of a deaf person, whether you are talking to him or her or not. All right. So for example, let's say I'm talking to whatever, my husband. All right. We're speaking. And I see out of the corner of my eye, one of my deaf friends coming up. I will start signing while I'm talking because I respect her and her access to communication, even though I'm not talking to her. What I'm saying to my husband has nothing to do with her, but I respect her enough to let her be a part of communication and let her know what I'm talking about, even if it's something stupid or that she doesn't even know anything about. And I mentioned this before, but signing and speaking at the same time messes up your ASL. But that would be one time when it would be acceptable, because even though it's messed up ASL and or maybe I could sign great ASL and then chopped up English for my husband or whatever, at least I'm trying my best to communicate, to give communicative access to both people. So, all righty. So another tip for hearing people: if you find yourself in the situation of being with a deaf person and a hearing person who does not sign, this is what I was just talking about. You may need to SimCom, which is sign and talk at the same time, in order to provide language access to both people. This will result in less than stellar ASL production on your part, but it is the polite and culturally sensitive thing to do in this situation. Language access, even imperfect language, for the deaf is respectful. Related to that is always be respectful of ASL as the language of the deaf. Don't assume you're fluent in ASL until you can have a full conversation with a deaf person. A culturally deaf person is always the authority on ASL. It's their language, not mine, not yours. So respect their authority that way. Another tip for hearing people is that it's rude to watch a signed conversation without informing the people signing that you know ASL. Now that's different from just you walk into a restaurant and hands are flying and you're like, I don't get one thing, right? If you understand even a little bit, you either need to interrupt, excuse me, to introduce yourself and let the deaf people know that you sign, or just move on. If you do interrupt and introduce yourself, if the conversation is private, then the participants will make any adjustments that they feel necessary. So don't worry about interrupting. Another tip is that eye contact is extremely important in deaf culture. Diverting your eyes is rude because you are missing something when you do. In hearing culture, hearing world, I can come over here and pick up my phone or my water bottle or whatever. And yeah, I'm still listening to you, right? I don't have to be looking at you. But if I'm signing with you and I look down at my phone, guess what? That was more important than what you were saying, right? So just keep that in mind. Eye contact, if you lose eye contact, you lose what was being said to you, what was being signed. In the same vein, visual distractions are very distracting to the deaf. So be mindful of a backlit window that makes it hard for them to see you. Be window of bright lights or long, colorful fingernails, and other things that would be visually distracting. This is kind of a fun thing that's quite unique to deaf culture. Talking with your mouth full is not considered rude in deaf culture. In fact, it's ideal. Filling your mouth with food so that you can easily sign and keep your eyes and your hands on the conversation is seen as the best way to do it. So again, going out to dinner or lunch with deaf friends is always fun for me because there is a fair amount of pile it in, and then we talk, then we sign. There is a way to sign quietly. If you are in some place like a place of worship or a solemn occasion like a funeral, quiet signing is small and gentle. It's more reserved than casual, normal, friendly conversation. Because deaf culture truly is a lot like a family, don't be surprised at that deaf goodbye hug. Hugging is a common way of bidding farewell in the deaf community.